Auf Augenhöhe.
Dear community, welcome to another edition of At Eye Level. This time with you, with our audience here in Düsseldorf. A warm welcome to you. Our topic today, there is no censorship. Basic Law, Article 5, Sentence 1. That's what we want to talk about today. In which areas do we experience censorship and what consequences does this possibly have for our freedom? I welcome our four guests with us today. From Zurich, Jeannette Fischer. Ms. Fischer, you are a psychoanalyst and author. And we're going to learn a lot today about how people feel when they're censored. I'm glad you're here for the first time today.
Thanks for the invitation.
I'm glad, thank you. I welcome Hannes Hofbauer, historian and publisher, from Austria. It's great that you're here, Mr. Hofbauer. I could also say, for the first time, but I realize that everyone is here for the first time. Then from Jens Fischer Rodrian I won't say it anymore. Welcome, nice to have you here, Mr. Hofbauer, and welcome to us. You have written a recent book called Censorship, and today we will also learn a lot from you about the history of censorship. I'm glad you're here.
I'm happy about the invitation.
I welcome Jens Fischer Rodrian, musician and poet. Hello, Mr. Fischer Rodrian.
Glad to be here.
Twice Fischer today.
Yes. I had to change the name because there is another Jens Fischer, a musician from Hamburg who also makes film music. The gentleman is older than me and I thought, I'll leave the name to him and I'll take my wife's name. That's how I settled it.
You have written a book, The Armada of the Mad.
Correct.
You might think it has something to do with today.
Yes, we will certainly talk about it later, but the assumption is correct.
Welcome. And then I warmly welcome Paul Brandenburg. You are a doctor and publicist, and I heard you have just arrived from Cologne.
And also the first time here. Long way from Cologne.
And you had trouble with the hotel room, but you seem calm. Do you get angry when it doesn't work?
Well, I have a scale for trouble entering rooms, and that was at the bottom of the scale, so it was no problem at all. No one came in unannounced. Not yet, not yet. The day is not over yet.
Well, there is no censorship. I would now like to continue introducing our group and ask Ms. Fischer a question. What does it do to a person's psyche when they are censored, when they are not allowed to express themselves freely?
So the censorship. Basically, such censorship means nothing other than, what you say and what you want is not what I want and what I want to hear. So it's a break in the relationship, breaking out of a community, that's censorship. Someone gets excluded, that's one thing. And that creates anger or dismay, and I assume you all know that. But what I find even worse is it's the accusation of guilt. So for that person, exclusion from the community or from society where an opinion is criminalized, for him it actually means. We don't want this opinion, or this person, he should stay outside. And that testifies to the weakness of the state. Or if we do it ourselves, looking for the whipping boy, then it testifies to our own weakness. We project. So when I censor someone, I project a harmfulness and a guilt onto that person. This stigmatizes that person. Well, I can censor someone for anything else, but specifically here, and that's our central theme here, it's coupled with guilt. And whoever has the all-embracing validity to interpret the guilt, he has the power. We have already had that in the church, with hell and so on. So the guilt is for me a very central theme in this story.
And the accusation is public. That is a characteristic of this censorship. I don't tell someone in the back room that something is wrong. The point of the censorship is that it takes place demonstratively before everyone else. It's a public denunciation.
Correct.
A public denunciation of the unworthiness of the censored.
And with it the exclusion from normal society.
As a doctor, have you ever had anything to do with censorship before? Do you know censorship?
This is actually the essential part of doctor socialization, you could say. Bad gossip always says there are regular courses, and then there is medicine. No, I mean that very seriously. I consider the intellectual demands on medical education to be very low. Most courses are far more demanding. The essence of what takes place in medical studies is training and conditioning to the customs and rights of the profession. At university, this still works to some extent. But then the specialized training begins. And this training is nothing other than a 6-year apprenticeship without training. It's just called apprenticeship. Instead, it is drudgery on minimum wage terms and totally dependent on those who are the training masters there. You don't believe in it. There is an orderly training catalog. It exists on paper. But it is not taught and not checked. What is trained there is obedience, and if you are not obedient, then you are punished by refusing the necessary signatures and confirmations. They say quite openly, if you don't want to do it, there will be no confirmation. And after 12 semesters of this kind of interaction,
Is that censorship?
it is a form of conditioning. Dissent is censored, you are suppressed, you get bad marks. It says this performance is bad, but in reality your protest was not admissible. Yes, that is then censored as bad performance, and after 12 semesters, the result is German doctors. No wonder there is a Frank Ulrich Montgomery or a Karl Lauterbach, who unfortunately is also a doctor. It's clearly a form of censorship, yes.
But that starts in kindergarten.
Certainly, it is no coincidence that those with the best grades later study medicine or psychology, where the numerous clauses is a 1. In my opinion, it is not those who are the best intellectually or in terms of character, but those who have received the best grades in this school system. We know how to get good grades, at least in the German school system. Hardly with intellectual or human performance.
Nevertheless, I would like to make a brief objection here. I think it's a bit sweeping to say, because that's how it comes across, that all doctors who emerge from this system are bad doctors. I don't think you can say that at all. There are individuals who are bad. I personally know many good doctors who have completed their training in conventional medicine, but who have subsequently also studied homeopathy or alternative medicine and learned other healing methods.
I could now counter that this is also a bit sweeping because of the accusation of being sweeping. Of course, there are excellent doctors in this training system. There are some who have eluded it in various ways, who are a bit on the sidelines, who perhaps have certain coping mechanisms. Doctors who deal with it differently, who endure it, who manage to bounce it off themselves in a collegial environment, and are still good doctors. There are not so few of them. My experience, and I wrote this down in a book many years ago, is that these doctors usually quickly leave for private practice and do not stay in the clinics. They tend to try to go rural, or into the unloved subjects disparagingly called talking medicine. They are poorly paid, there is no glory in it, and then there are the professional doctors in the clinics. And I also know excellent, great colleagues. Unfortunately, my experience is that most of them are poorly educated. And that's not because of stupidity, it's not because they're worse people, it's because of people who, in my opinion, could have been broken in this system.
Jens Fischer Rodrian, as a musician. Art can do anything at the moment, right? You wrote The Armada of Mad, and that was in Corona time. That's something I'm wondering, where is there censorship?
Yes, the title hasn't been censored and the book is still doing pretty well, so there hasn't been any hostility towards the book in that regard. But there were certain things that didn't work, such as crowdfunding, which was cancelled shortly before. There have already been notes of protest about this book and the accompanying album, so there was censorship after all. But of course the question is not only justified, it's essential. Art should be allowed to do anything except incite violence. But art is so important, and art in handcuffs doesn't work. You have to be able to do that. The difference between entertaining art and art that is dedicated to expression, where it is very important to want to express something through poetry, that's what the book is about. We collected resistance poems, I collected them and asked colleagues. Even people you wouldn't expect to write poems, but they write wonderful things, Matthias Burchardt or Wolfgang Wodarg, for example. He has written over 300 poems, and I say, yes, he sees it from several perspectives. He writes poetry, he's a doctor. He has a lot to say about today. Art should be allowed to do everything. But when I look at what's happening in art right now, the opportunities for myself or colleagues who don't agree with the circumstances of the last 2 years and also comment on them, then I have to say, censorship is taking place.
Herr Hofbauer, the history of censorship. Are there documents where you can say, that's where it started?
Yes, censorship is basically a method of domination to enforce one's own discourse sovereignty. It does not matter whether the rule is Christian Catholic, as in the late Middle Ages, when printing began, we can talk about that later, or in the absolutist state. Or today in a kind of mixture between large corporations in California, which dominate the digital spaces in our country, and the European Union or the Federal Republic of Germany. But censorship is always a sign of weakness. I came up with that in the course of doing research for my book. When rulers feel safe, they don't need prohibitions. Then you can discuss it, you can talk to your opponents openly and at eye level.
By the way, that is also our goal here, thank you for saying that. Because that's very important to me to say, everyone is welcome here. We tried again and again, but unfortunately only got rejections.
Not only, we are here.
No, rejections from the other side, as you call it. Rejections from people we would like to invite to this topic. Journalists, doctors, historians who see it differently. But nothing comes. You can count yourself lucky if a rejection comes at all. Most of the time you ask and you don't hear anything.
Now that brings me to censorship's little sisters, silencing, or defaming, or what you said, conditioning of life courses or professions. We also learned that manipulation is the little sister of censorship. The censorship is then something heavier, yes, there is really more to it than that. It starts with banning thoughts, and ends with killing people. Yes, that has happened over and over again over time, and it's not out of the question even now, I would say. And what I said earlier, that censorship is a sign of weakness, sounds a bit encouraging at first. You think if they're weak, then we're actually strong. And that's true. In the digital space, censorship mainly affects those who have a high number of clicks and a large reach. If it's some kind of small WhatsApp group that comes up with something special together, it won't upset anyone, from a political point of view. But at the same time it is natural that rule in weakness always thrashes around wildly, also historically. So you can see that it usually ends in armed conflicts.
Does that mean you can tell where it's going by the level of censorship in a society, is it correct? Or lead them?
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think it's a good idea. Yes, the degree of censorship shows how tarnished the ruling structures are. Censorship is just one point. Bans can also be pronounced differently, but censorship is an important point in our area: media, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and so on. And when that club gets swung a lot, I think that's the end of that kind of rulership. And you can feel that. The transatlantic area is in decline, so to speak, and the Chinese area is on the rise. And that already plays a role for our area here. The panic of the rulers, the spreading of fear, we have felt all that. In the criticism of the corona measures, in the reception of the Russian worldview or Ukraine, you can really see the fear that is then passed on to the subjects of the rulers, that is, to the people. The time in which we live, it is not a nice time. But, good news at the end of my first speech: censorship never succeeds completely. We are sitting here. We are discussing it openly. Alternative media has become very popular in the last 10 to 15 years, and the loss of trust in mainstream media is enormous. Starting with the lie about the Iraq War in 2003, etc., and with the lies about the corona measures and so on. And so people are looking for ways to get information. And this is precisely the point at which the opposition, as it were, comes into conflict with the ruling structures that issue bans.
Can I ask you a quick question? You just described the state of censorship as something that has existed for an extremely long time. In your perception, where did it start? Clearly there were 2020 in March, but I have the feeling that it started before that. Certain alternative portals came under massive pressure even before that.
I was just thinking, if you ask me when it started, I'd say, with the printing press.
Yes. But I mean, when did it start to gain momentum? Because it became really visible in March 2020, but I remember a story in I think 2017, when Ken Jebsen was supposed to get a prize, and I think Mr. Lederer massively opposed it.
Culture senator, I think.
Yes, from Berlin, exactly. So you mean that what has now been accelerated to an extreme degree has already taken place before?
This happened earlier. 2016, the European Union set up a task force against Russian-style propaganda, whatever propaganda is. 2017, the Network Enforcement Act. Actually, that's when the censorship story started in Germany. A year later, the European Union started the Code of Conduct Against Misinformation. What is misinformation? It's not a legal term, so double effect, and then the Media State Treaty 2020, and it goes on like that. And to that extent, I think you're right. This doesn't start with the corona issue, but this goes back to the mid-2010s, I would say.
I would say that in modern times this point in time can be pushed back at will. Like it or not, the AfD was treated in a similar way. The images that fit the narrative were shown and those that would have contradicted it were left out. This framing is also a form of censorship. And the selective omission is part of the media, I think. I think the exciting question that arises is, how does the change in technology affect censorship? What's really new is that it's extremely difficult to control media consumption on such a broad basis of many technologies at once. In the past, you could shut down a print shop or a newspaper and so on. Today, you have to apply pressure in many places at once. YouTube is going along with it, but thousands of other platforms are not. And I can imagine that techniques are changing in this area. I think you can see that in the last weeks and months. Example, Nancy Faeser. She is for me the indicator for the absolute non-culture. She's become the board queen lately. She just says we. We have agreed, we have decided. The people who are in the room now are the we. The message is, everyone who participates belongs. Everyone else, not, you're not we.
Our Minister of the Interior.
Ms. Faeser is our chief constitutional enemy, acting Minister of the Interior. I have the impression that the more modern means of censorship are more of an attempt at storytelling. To find and coin certain terms, right? Like corona deniers. If you look at the term corona denier, I have just learned from the District Court of Cologne, you can call me corona denier, the Tagesspiegel has done. I was there, had a live discussion with the editors. It's a Berlin regional newspaper. I explained my opinion to them as to why the existing coronaviruses and the disease COVID-19 are overrated in my view. After that, they called me a corona skeptic and later a corona denier. I have objected that I find this incorrect because I do not deny that corona or COVID-19 existed. The judges in Cologne said, "Oh yes." In the German language, it is not possible to distinguish between skeptics, deniers, and critics. That's how I reacted, but they were serious about it. So it's the struggle over the terms and what these terms actually mean. And in the term corona denier resonates for me Holocaust denier. That's a similar composite. I don't think it's a coincidence that that's exactly what was chosen. The number of syllables, the intonation, and you try to work with this rephrasing of the terms. Perhaps even more than by preventing the spread of news.
It sure is aimed. I mean, critics can be positive and negative. Also skeptics, but deniers? It's a relatively simple story.
Not in district court.
All right. But I had a similar experience, since we were talking about censorship in art, that, for example, at a Bards festival to which I was invited, in the UFA factory in Berlin, a journalist from the TAZ called and asked why the corona denier Jens Fischer Rodrian is allowed to play there, whether that would not be strange. I am clearly Measure's critic, and I have been since May 2020, but I have never denied corona in any conversation, interview, or post. But the word denier is just much stronger than Measure's critic, or anything like that. Therefore, it is certainly targeted.
I don't think I've ever had a guest at this table who denied that. And we've been doing this for over 2 years now. So Ms. Fischer, you...
It cannot be distinguished, the terms are so the same.
I would like to come back to your comments. It shows a weakness in the discourse of domination when censorship increases. From a psychoanalytic point of view, it is a weakness when one is no longer willing to deal with the other, that is weakness. And I think we all have to be a bit careful as this conversation picks up speed, so that we don't do the same as the others. Mainly, that we unite, so to speak, we all have the same opinion, we are nice to each other. We make such a symbiotic clinch and applaud each other, so do I, when we have named the whipping boy and know the culprit.
Und wir applaudieren, also ich auch, wir applaudieren, wenn wir den Sündenbock benannt haben und den Schuldigen kennen.
And I think peace work for me actually means that we should leave this discourse of guilt. I repeat, that we leave the guilt. Mainly, that there is a victim and a perpetrator, and this perpetrator is guilty, and we are all victims when we are called corona deniers.
Und dieser Täter ist schuldig. Wir sind vielleicht alle Opfer, dass wir so als Corona-Leugner bezeichnet werden.
And if we go into this victim position, even if we defend ourselves and fight back, then we can name a perpetrator from this victim position. And that's an amazing dynamic.
Durch diese Opferposition können wir einen Täter benennen.
It is a dynamic.
Yes, dynamic. And we do it ourselves. Well, if we're really honest with ourselves, we'll do it all the time. With our children, with the grandchildren, with our partners. There is always this guilt discourse. I know it from my practice. There comes the woman or the man and he says or she says, yeah, if only my partner were a little bit different, we'd be happy. And they both say that, and it's always the same. That's how it is, and I think we have this chance now.
Some here have looked at each other.
I think we have a chance now to get out of this discourse of domination that works with guilt, that works insanely well with guilt. We have a chance to get out of that discourse.
Aus diesem Diskurs auszusteigen.
I say that in psychoanalysis, we distinguish between two types of aggression. We say that one aggression is aggression in the service of the ego, that is, a constructive aggression that we need to defend ourselves, to confront ourselves, for the sexual act. We need this constructive aggression, which is never harmful to the other, even though the other may be frustrated or dissatisfied. And then destructive aggression, which is aimed at really hurting the other person. We are currently, probably for some time, but I'm talking about now, in a society where this constructive aggression is classified and stigmatized as destructive. We see that, for example, if a man comes too close to me, it amounts to sexual assault and so on. This narrative is getting crazier and crazier. And we now have the opportunity to step out of this discourse and not shift the blame back and forth. Maybe we can open, in psychoanalysis we call it an intersubjective space, that is, a space between two or more subjects. And there the dispute, the argument, the conflict and the desire can take place.
I agree, this is a very important point. Unfortunately, I'm not a psychoanalyst, just a simple emergency doctor. I draw an important conclusion from this: people like Karl Lauterbach are not our problem. When he goes, another comes.
Yes.
And I think that's very important to be aware of that. My personal attitude to this person is probably clear, but if you have understood that the problem is not in this person, or in Marcus Soter, or in other, then it is also clear that calls for aggression, this hate projection, this demand for revenge are completely useless.
Is that perhaps even cynicism, so to speak?
Then I would now destroy my existence with bad jokes. No, I personally believe that humor is always necessary, important and right, whether everyone likes it or not. Because the best thing is when you can laugh.
But there is humor and there is hurtful humor.
No, honestly I find the hurtful humor quite acceptable. The question is how far it goes. And anyone who goes public must be able to live with being aggressively attacked, so to speak. But that is another question. The important thing is that we have to stop assuming that if just that one person were gone, be it the personal partner or the health minister, the problem would be gone. These people are just embodiments of the problem behind it. Which exactly, we can and must discuss. But this is a very important reason. And secondly, these feelings of revenge and demands for revenge really lead us astray, because they encourage people like Mr. Soter, who fantasizes about a corona RAF and thus gives reason to take action against the critics. We make it harder for ourselves to discuss this, so I'm happy to join in. I admit that I often have a hard time overcoming this aggression. Sorry.
Mr. Hofbauer. Perhaps again Mrs. Fischer and then.
I wanted to get back to you about this usurpation of terms, so that's a very important thing you mentioned. This one term, but there are many others. Solidarity, for example. What did we do in solidarity in the Corona era? You had to get vaccinated to actually send the profits to the big pharmaceutical companies. That's the real meaning behind it, in my opinion. Or now the whole discourse about Ukraine. What is solidarity? Banning everything Russian from our culture, including all artists. And female artists, and dead artists included.
Tchaikovsky is no longer played.
I want a short break in between. I want to give a very striking example that shocked me. And I don't want the big issue Ukraine, Russia now. To be honest, my summary, I know that I don't know anything, because it's just very complex. But what I know when I hear that a company like Playmobil no longer ships to Russia is that something is wrong. Because are the Russian children to blame for this conflict? That was my moment where I thought, this can't be true. If I were Playmobil and everything went well, I would send huge containers of toys to both countries, Ukraine and Russia, so that the children there at least have fun.
But this goes under the term solidarity, that the Playmobil participates. And Ritter Chocolate doesn't advertise. I don't like them, but when Ritter sells chocolate in Russia, Welt and Sonntag and perhaps many other media criticize it. Because now she always sells chocolate to Russia. This is a lack of solidarity, or the term lateral thinker. I also looked it up for the book. The lateral thinker term in the Duden was still called a few years ago. What was it called? Creative thinking. Exactly, creative thinking that not everyone can understand. So you were lateral thinkers back then. And today it is used as a defamation. Any group of people doing something good or bad, that's another question. But it is very much about the sovereignty of the discourse. And if it gets worse, then it will be banned.
A question for you, Ms. Fischer.
May I say something in advance? That is my critique of this panel. We should not seek any other form of solidarity here by again positing a common enemy.
Eine andere Form der Solidarität finden, indem wir auch wieder einen gemeinsamen Feind postulieren.
And by that, I don't mean that I'm a Putin supporter or Putin opponent. No, I'm not commenting on that. But I would like to insist a little that we are opening a new discourse here.
Dass wir auch hier einen neuen Diskurs eröffnen.
That is exactly the point of my question. What has happened in the last 2 years is an exclusion from the discourse. That is, people who have argued very reasonably, whether medically or legally or even through art, they are no longer part of a public discourse. After a long time, it triggers frustration. And frustration also makes you passive in a way, I would say. How do we get out of this passivity and manage to talk to each other again? So that we can also discuss the pain that has accompanied us at eye level. How do we get out of this together? I totally agree with you. I don't think this bubble will do us any good in the long run. I do not believe that. However, I notice that parallel societies are beginning to form. I notice that there are performance venues that suddenly spring up like mushrooms, while others are no longer accessible to some artists. Of course, it's nice when you can finally appear again as an artist critical of measures. But that's not a long-term solution to growing together. Hence my question to you, how do we get into this discourse now, after 2 years of injury and exclusion? How do we go into this discourse?
I think an important question you need to answer for yourself is, do I want to go there with those who exclude me, and why? I'm not saying you shouldn't let it. Sigmund Freud said, you can make and do anything, you just have to know why. So ask yourself this question. And I think what is a little helpful is that it is a projection. So if Paul Brandenburg has a home invasion and gets arrested, that is an aggressive projection onto him that he is evil, that he is willfully evil and harming society and harming other people.
Dass böse ist und mutwillig böse ist und der Gesellschaft und anderen Menschen schadet.
So it's a projection, and we all do that. We are all always projecting something onto someone. I can project too. And you can project onto me, I am the most beautiful, the best and the dearest. What I'm saying is that any projection never has anything to do with the person it's projected on.
Mit dem Menschen zu tun, auf den das projiziert wird.
And the scale goes from the very nasty to the cutest. We should realize that even when violence is used, it is a projection. But that helps us to gain some distance intellectually. It is a projection. In psychoanalysis, we call this projective identification. One should not identify with the projection. Conversely, if everyone thinks I'm the greatest, I can end up thinking I'm the greatest. That means I identify with the projection, but that has nothing to do with me. So that's where you're supposed to distance yourself a little bit. That's how you also get out of these surging emotions, which usually also have a self-destructive character. When you're in this impotent rage, then you're also impotent. Aren't you? And then it also becomes self-destructive, and it's an enormous stress factor.
Und dann wird es auch selbstdestruktiv und es ist ein enormer Stressfaktor.
And further to your question, if you have gained a little distance by analyzing the situation, then perhaps you can get more into personal dismay than into the inner uprising and opposition. For example, being sad or crying or something. Something that has a purifying character and is not destructive against itself.
Ich weiß nicht, traurig sein oder weinen oder irgendwas, oder? Etwas, das einen reinigenden Charakter hat und nicht destruktiv gegen sich selbst ist.
No, that's not what I mean.
I have noticed that we have a very different level of discussion, Mrs. Fischer. Because I don't have anything to do with effervescent projections, I don't have anything with personal concern, but with me it's all about analysis. This is historical, the other is economic, political, cultural. And that's when I realized that there are power relations and we felt them. She sensed a certain scene. The radical left scene felt the balance of power in the 1970s. In Turkey, the Kurds feel the balance of power and so on. And to analyze them, in my opinion, you need a look that, in my opinion, does not go so far as to require a new discourse. You have to understand the discourse that was going on there. He has stripped people of their basic rights based on assumptions. I accuse no one of personal malice, not even Bill Gates. He doesn't have to be angry at all, he's allowed to have his economic rationality, he's invested in pharmaceutical companies, he wants to vaccinate 7 billion people. I understand that, but of course it's terrible for these 7 billion and for the world. And I think you need to unravel that and realize that we're on the other side. Well, I have no problem with that, it just doesn't align with my own goals. I don't agree with Bill Gates' worldview or his agenda. Not even with his way of doing business. I don't think he's malicious, I really don't think so. I would really say he can plan everything etc., but there are economic interests, there are political interests and they prevail in certain situations. In my opinion, this has a lot to do with the fact that we've had the global economic crisis since 2008, and now new capital groups are being built up with state help, biotechnology, pharmaceutical medicine, artificial intelligence, and they are subsidized by the state, just like the railroads were around 1870. And that's my interest, so to speak, to recognize that. I don't have many other interests, I'll admit that. But I think if you don't realize that, then it's going to be difficult to come to a nice society, to come to a better life.
I intervene quickly, yes, that's fine. I'm just breaking down the discourse of power to the interpersonal level, sorry.
But I have a problem with that, even if I can understand your statement. The main difference here is, we're not talking about the interpersonal relationship between two people in the audience, we're talking about the relationship between people and their government. And he has little critical ability and seems to me to have very little interest in relationship work. In this respect, the analytical path is at best good for the person concerned in order to better deal with his or her concerns, which is important and good. But for me, as you said, the crucial question is, how do we get out of the situation and finally do something constructively different? And I don't think we're in a bubble anymore. Because when I look at how this corona time has affected my personal environment, it has actually destroyed my bubble. And in retrospect, I'm actually glad it did. Before that, probably like many others, I had a rather more homogeneous circle of friends and acquaintances in terms of their political views, their background, their origins, and that has become totally mixed. And I now experience a completely heterogeneous coexistence of people from very different social classes and religious backgrounds. I see this as a great opportunity, I see growth. Yes, it is frustrating that in this group you have to defend yourself against a majority society that is very present in the media. That's why the questions are important. How do we deal with these terms? For example, usurpation. We have historical role models like the Christians. They have made the cross to which they were nailed their symbol. Or gay was originally a dirty word for gays in America, and they have adopted the term, call themselves gay, and are proud of it. Lateral thinkers I know react the same way. They write it on a t-shirt, I can understand it.
Or Schwurbler.
Schwurbler, exactly. I would say, let's accept those names and say, yes, call me that. It doesn't bother me when they call me a corona denier, it bothers me that language is allowed to be raped like that. But it doesn't offend me. And that's what I think is very important about the analytic approach, that we have to be free from making everything about ourselves and therefore being hurt or angry. So I say, just let them yap. But I think we should actively stop the misuse of these terms. We should reclaim them by showing their true meaning. An old friend of mine from the GDR, formerly at Stasi, says, it used to be very easy here. We knew exactly when the conversation was over. The boss came in and said, well, comrade, now it's over. Are you for peace or are you against it? And we knew very well that the end of the conversation had come. Because if you keep arguing at that moment, you're against peace, and then of course you're a very bad person. And that's exactly what we have today. Because if you don't respond with stay well, then you are, sorry, yes, that's the modern greeting. When the baker says goodbye, stay healthy, I look at him and intentionally shake my head.
But I find it hard to say that this is the new Heil Hitler.
Yes, it is. Of course not, and that is a clear provocation.
Exactly. I find so too. And I ask myself, are comparisons of this kind too cynical, so to speak?
No, I don't see it that way. It's about making something clear. After all, what's the point of such an absurd greeting as Heil Hitler? Of course, this Hitler, this terrible mass murderer Hitler, was a completely different figure than our present situation. But with this artificial greeting, something was created at that time that immediately showed which side you were on. Someone who doesn't answer something like that immediately outed himself. He just has to keep silent and makes himself suspicious. With such a radical greeting, you force the other person, or you ask him to confess. Otherwise, unfortunately, it always has to be said very clearly, of course, nothing of what we are experiencing right now can be compared with the crimes of National Socialism. Just the assumption that I want to say something like that. I know you didn't mean to imply anything, but we know some people like to do it. Example Brandenburg, etc. But it is these mechanisms and these methods that try to condition people and force them to behave in a certain way. So that you can say right away, yes, I wish you the same, stay healthy. It's like with the masks, you don't want a confrontation. And I keep saying, we have to live with it. But I think we should remain friendly in such a moment and say, thank you, I stay healthy. So that everything can become friendlier. But you have to be ready to endure this confrontation and turn it into something positive, not become aggressive. But I think we can deal with it more confidently and let this bubble grow bigger. I think it's good, and I have the impression that it's very diverse.
I think that was 1929, 100 years ago. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, said that in his opinion all revolutions failed because they were stuck with patricide and did not realize a new vision or utopia. Patricide in the figurative sense stands for an authority that stands before us, that we have grown up with, that needs to be eliminated so that the way is clear for me as an authority. He also said that many revolutions were really nothing more than patricides, and the vision for the aftermath would not have materialized. There was only a shift in power, but the discourse of power itself did not change at all. And I think so, too. And that's why I argue for the analysis of the discourse of domination. Where do we participate? How do we participate? Every single one of us. So that we get out of there and into an area that brings us joy. Really, a joy. We don't know it so well anymore. The joy and the desire and the pleasure, everything is, somehow negative and harmful.
When you walk through the city, that's exactly what you think. You think, where is the joy of life? Where is the glow in the eyes? Here, for example, with our audience, I have noticed an extreme glow in the last few days. There is joie de vivre and fortunately there is love for life.
Exactly that. This joylessness, this guilt narrative, everything is bad, everything produces CO2, everything is harmful. And every now and then I post deliberately provocative things and say, I burned gasoline today, then flew away, then drove fast, and that was great. Yes, I stand by it. And then many people around me say, oh, that's not reasonable. We're always afraid of embarrassing ourselves, not pleasing ourselves, but I think you have to show character and stand by what you like. Here in the Rhineland, for God's sake, you can go to confession later, that's what Catholicism is for. We should stand by it and celebrate it. The first thing I personally did when this corona craze started was to invite people I didn't know to dinner every week, which we cooked together. And that's also how we met through acquaintances, and that was wonderful. This instrument of domination, to create guilt as soon as we let ourselves go, as soon as we like something, to censor ourselves immediately, that is the ultimate form of oppression. We want to forbid ourselves immediately. It was no different in the church. And the question remains, what do we do about it? I absolutely want to agree, because the revolution is not an end in itself. Simply eliminating those in power doesn't help at all. We need something better, not just an acquisition.
We have two problems. We have a lot of problems, of course, but the two problems we have to deal with now are, first, a lot of joy has been taken away from us in the last 2 years. Especially when you look at the children drawing faces, the moon is missing. That sounds simple, but it is tragic. What did this wearing of masks do in schools? Among other things, there is a story that you just described, the sociability suffered from it, which not only lets us feel life, but even boosts our immune system. The sociability in the form that we are with each other and stay healthy, in the head and in the heart, and also physically. That's the one. How do we get back there? What I observe on train rides, which are exhausting when I'm the only one without a mask. Or the only one walking through the city without a mask. And there comes one, but he also puts on a mask, even though no one else is there. Heavy. I think to myself, we've come so far, how do we get out of there? I often ask myself this question. And on the other hand, what you just described is developing, a parallel society where you invite 20 to 30 other people during lockdown, where only 4 people are allowed in a room. You do it. And this world can. Even if the risk of consequences is great, I admit, yes, we have given concerts for 60, 70 people, even at a time when only 4 people are allowed to gather.
And if that ever happens again, we know more places now than we did 2 years ago. There will be more concerts. But it's still very important that we say, at least I imagine it like this.
If this parallel society is attractive, if this parallel society conveys desire, joy, and a willingness to engage in discussion, then I could imagine that one or the other who is perhaps still cautious and still skeptical would say, what is actually going on with you? When he's seen his 35th Netflix series, he might think, there's another concert over there and I'm sitting here alone with my Netflix series. I've said that before in another conversation. I guess if this other world sounds very big now, but what I mean has to have something to offer. That we can offer something where, above all, we can get back into conversation. Because otherwise we will discuss the most intensive topics in a completely different way. I've always loved it when my father, who had a very interesting political past, voted for almost every party except AfD. I loved the discussions with the people in his closest circle of friends, who tended to be very conservative. The time when he might have just decided to vote for the left or the SPD, it was so exciting to hear the discourse as a kid. They argued violently, and then sat more peacefully over the second or third glass of wine. If wine was involved when the argument started, it wasn't always funny, though. What I'm saying is that it was okay to have very different opinions. And to open up this space again, that we can come to these people and also say, hey, what we have to say is not gibberish, but exciting and will enrich both of us. That's just the other side we have to serve. And I think it's immensely important for the future.
I would like to ask the historian again. Mr. Hofbauer, if you hear what Mr. Fischer Rodrian says, there's a lot of improvisation going on during this time. As we have now heard, concerts were still given. What was it like back then in different systems? Has it always been the case that creativity triumphed in the end?
It's always been like that, yes. Creativity cannot be eradicated, but of course it is restricted by the measures. Like the printing bans back then, because the Catholic Church felt threatened by possible mass production in the 15th century. With the printing press, the only truth could not be proclaimed from the pulpit alone. Suddenly, controversially, it could be printed and distributed to a few people who could read, but their numbers increased. Or nowadays, as you put it. I wanted to come back to the word bubble now, I don't really like it. It's about society, and society is rearranging itself. Well, that's what we've seen in the last 2.5 years, and that's what we'll see in the near future, with the approaching war. Even if I see the fight somehow avoidable. And it is not only society that is reordering itself, but personal relationships are also reordering themselves. And there, on the one hand, we have to pay attention to how that happens. On the other hand, we also have to intervene, so to speak. And when I look at how, for example, Der Spiegel reacted to the click numbers of RT Deutsch or of Ken FM, those were the portals that had the most click numbers, they reacted with censorship. That was in the period from May 2020 to May 2021. There are studies that prove that something like RT Deutsch or Ken FM was able to generate more click numbers than Tagesschau, Der Spiegel and Bild combined. Yes, so that was really the end of the debate about the sovereignty of discourse. And then it really got going with the state media treaty, with the bans that ultimately muzzled these portals, for example. That has to be said. The people are still there, but they're doing something else now. You can still receive RT German, but you can also read Appellate or Seine. There are many portals and arguments about it. Der Spiegel started a campaign that I found very interesting. They said, these are only the left and right fringes of society. And if you look at the statistics that are published by American companies, you see that the left and right fringes have grown more and more and the middle has become smaller and smaller. So there are no more bubbles, but in concrete terms society has changed a lot. The left and the right, whatever Der Spiegel called it, they became, so to speak, mainstream on certain issues. We had the issue of skepticism about the prevailing discourse. It is noticeable that, for example, those who pushed forward the criticism of the measures are now also more skeptical when it comes to the question of how I assess what is happening in Ukraine. Because they are used to it. Aha. You've lied before, maybe it's a lie again now, you don't know. I don't want to go into the subject now. But this skepticism, this basic skepticism is a wonderful starting point with which we as skeptical people can live quite well and can act within this social framework.
Can I ask you something specific about that? I noticed that there were some people in the cultural sector in particular who were very, very cautious and did not necessarily defame them, but nevertheless viewed the measures very skeptically, critics who now look at the matter in a much more differentiated way on the subject of Ukraine. We have a chance via this Ukraine-Russia conflict now to get the people retroactive to what happened through and with Corona.
I want to intervene.
funken?
Gladly.
I was too slow. You shouldn't think so much.
Also,
The way I interpret it, we assume that we are the better ones here together with the audience. With Ukraine, we would do it differently, of course we would do it differently, but better. Are we better off watching less or no Netflix? I find that a bit presumptuous.
Ob wir besser sind, wenn wir weniger oder gar kein Netflix schauen, also das finde ich dann ein bisschen, das finde ich überheblich. Und
My request is that we start with ourselves, I think. Because the only thing that connects people, and I repeat this in my books, the only thing that connects people is not love, but the recognition of differences. That the other is not me. And we like to form a community where the other is like me, and then we think we're a big me, and that's how we'd be strong.
Nicht ich ist. Also und wir bilden doch gerne Gemeinschaft, dass der andere auch ist wie ich. Und wir denken, dann sind wir ein großes Ich und sind wir stark.
But the fact that we as me are actually alone, and everyone else is not me, we have to endure that first, right? And we don't even know it, because we quickly get caught up in this symbiotic strife. We have to endure it and endure the difference. If someone watches Netflix for days, it's up to me to endure what they're doing, that's it. I don't have to love that person, I have to.
Diese Leistung zu vollbringen, das auszuhalten, das ist so. Ich muss diesen Menschen nicht lieben. Ich muss ihn
Accept what he does.
I have to acknowledge him, and that this is his decision, and that he does it this way. And that this is okay for him. Everything else, no. Everything else is arrogant.
I understand you, but that's not what I meant.
Oh, that's how I understood it, okay.
Would you like?
I don't think that's the point. Sorry. I don't think we're the better people. I'm not a we with you either. We may have similar opinions in some cases. I also don't think the movement claims to be better people. I am not experiencing the discussion from this position. If you bring such an example, the Netflix shower. I once wrecked a cargo bike rider. Those are just humorous or exaggerated simple methods to create an image. I don't think that's the point. Regarding what you said just now, I believe that an upheaval is taking place, a change in society. It comes from science. Max Planck once said, "A new truth does not usually assert itself in such a way that its opponents declare themselves educated, but because they die out and the new generation has a completely different knowledge." I think that's what we're watching right now. I don't think it's a struggle, it's a process. Because the facts about corona are known. The only question is, how do we deal with it? Do we start with strong opponents? I don't think it's about arrogance or that we have to try to integrate the opposition. I agree with you if that's what you mean. It is important not to turn this into a personal conflict and not to be aggressive against those who think differently. But this difference exists, I can see it. It's very important that we do it in a positive way. And as far as censorship, we probably agree that it exists, it clearly takes place. I agree that now it's not about punishing the censor, blaming the censor, but we have to do it differently. We must not censor. We have to invite those who are doing this censorship and speak honestly with them. I do the same as you. I've invited Herr Lauterbach countless times, he doesn't answer. Oddly enough, Ms. Lang doesn't answer either. And yet we must continue to invite them. But we can make fun of them, that's a legitimate means. You can do that especially with rulers within the framework of human principles that you shouldn't violate. But such an important mechanism is perfectly legitimate for laughing, enjoying life and caricaturing such people. And I think it's allowed. I don't think it's misanthropic and warlike.
I would like to clarify the matter briefly, including the accusation of arrogance. I meant something else, and I just want to be very specific. I also watch Netflix, my family also watches Netflix. It's not about saying here's the good concert goer and here's the bad Netflix viewer. What I'm saying is that people were told that this kind of consumption and this kind of desocialization, in the sense of not being together anymore, was imposed from the outside. I just want to take that as an example that people were told, don't meet. Don't leave your rooms, don't leave your apartment, stay alone, you can do other things, like Netflix. After all, you can talk differently. And if you do, really out of panic fear of this virus, I myself had done it for a while. When you realize that, I had this virus too, I was even sick, it wasn't as bad as they said. But if I'm still in this loop of doing what I'm told by an authority that I personally don't trust anymore, and then come to the point where I say, no, I'm going to the neighbor today. I want to take that step. I'm not saying that watching Netflix is bad, and I'm not saying that I put people who have done it before above other people, some for legitimate reasons. Maybe you have an illness and parents with a heart problem. And he just has a different fear than someone who is healthy themselves, has a healthy family and doesn't have an older environment. From the side, I want to take this fear very seriously. I even want to go the next step and say, let's face the fear, I'm scared too. I'm scared shitless that this country is going down the drain. And that will get to the point where I don't know how I'm going to get my kids through the next 10 years here. I just don't want it to be misunderstood. I absolutely understand that. My main point is, as it says in this one song, invite people to join you. I want to dare to have this discourse, but also to say, no, there are no better or worse here among the people who meet. But I would also like to say quite clearly that there are people who have deliberately separated people from each other, and have done so for 2.5 years, and I find that very bad.
Very briefly, I find it very crucial. What is important is the acceptance of being different. We actually learned that at school. Many got it, some didn't, okay. But even in our anti-measures movement, we never said, nobody should get vaccinated, for example. It is perfectly clear. I have good friends who get vaccinated, it does not go that far, on the contrary. They can talk about anything. But what I can't stand is when I'm told, I have to get vaccinated because there's an Austrian law. This is where the acceptance of the other side ends, or now in the current situation, peace or war. So, peace.
I wanted to add one more thing. I also see arrogance above all in the critics, which I have experienced several times. I think this wording, we have to wait for the sleeping sheep to wake up, is the real insane arrogance in my eyes. First to believe that people are asleep, but above all to believe that I can enlighten them. And in my profession.
And that at this electricity price.
Thank you. As a physician, I am part of a professional group that has been constantly told for the last 2 years how immunology works, from bakers to quantum physicists. I spent a few years in the lab, I know them. But I don't even dare to take part in a conversation, because then I hear, you didn't research that properly. It really is insane presumption. Of course, just because I'm an immunologist doesn't automatically make me better informed. But thinking that I can explain to the other what is right and what is wrong is something we should be wary of. Basically, we criticize everything, but being against it doesn't automatically mean that we're right. And this criticism often overshoots the mark. I experience it when I talk somewhere about the topic of corona vaccination. I refuse to call that thing a vaccination, it's an experimental medicinal substance. Then afterwards I hear, you did quite well. They shake hands because we know each other from YouTube. But you still haven't fully understood that vaccination in itself is bad, and viruses don't exist. Guys, they exist, I've seen them. This person doesn't like it, puts forward the theory viruses don't exist and tries to tell me I'm not fully awake yet. And that's the kind of arrogance I mean. I agree with you, we should let them do their thing and not imply that the other person is not reasonable and cannot do that. Perhaps modestly say, I see it differently, and I expect you to accept my different view. Or from you, because that's exactly what you expect. That's absolutely okay. Everyone can get what they want vaccinated, but they don't have the right to force others to do it.
I would like to introduce one more aspect. Mr. Hofbauer said so well, war or peace? Peace, of course. And if I understood you correctly, Mrs. Fischer, you say, it's about putting yourself in order, that is, finding peace within yourself. Don't look for the enemy on the outside. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, I'm not a supporter of this thesis, always look for everything in yourself first. But better to look at which power discourses we move. Also in interpersonal relationships.
In welchen Machtdiskursen existieren wir, auch in den zwischenmenschlichen Beziehungen.
Okay, I misunderstood.
Yes. Well, I'm not in favor of analyzing everything in depth, although I'm an analyst. But what we can do really starts with ourselves, in terms of the outside, in terms of the relationship. And practice this heterogeneity in the relationship and this recognition of the difference there, because that actually means freedom. This acknowledgement of being different is piecework for me, and also freedom for me when I no longer have to see whether the other person thinks the same way as I do. Then I don't have to convince him.
Nicht mehr schauen muss, als dass andere auch so meint wie ich, dann muss ich ihn nicht überzeugen.
Then I don't have to control that person, I don't have to use violence, and I don't have to manage that person. Today, much is exercised through administration. All this work is then omitted, because I can regulate myself with regard to a you. And this regulation is freedom for me. And for me that is peace work. If I can permanently transform and install my attitude towards the other person, because the I is constituted only by the you. Without the you we would become insane. And I consider that to be central.
I would like to ask Mr. Brandenburg. You said earlier that you can understand what Ms. Fischer is saying, in the sense that we don't look so much for the enemy in politics or in the Minister of Health, but look at ourselves. On the other hand, in your podcast you always say at the end, we have to chase the politicians peacefully out of their offices. That's a different statement then, isn't it?
I see it differently. The person acting is not the source of the idea, that is my statement behind it. It's not Mr. Lauterbach who invented this system that we live in now, although the healthcare system is one that he was instrumental in shaping. But these are people who represent an ideology, who have a certain attitude that I think prevails in current politics. I think they're totalitarian, and I think they're fascist to some extent. They have a view of people and a self-image that I consider pathological. When you constantly talk about we have decided or we have agreed on rules, the people concerned are infantilized. I find many things in this policy quite terrible. But it is not the person Annalena Baerbock who invented this and acts like this. It would be illusory to believe that if I just kill the chief villain, as in Lord of the Rings, then the whole realm of evil will collapse. That's childish and that's stupid. We want simple solutions. It would be easy, as they say, eliminate Mr. Lauterbach. But that is not only criminal and terrible, to say that is stupid. Because with Mr. Lauterbach the system will not collapse. But there are many representatives of such a system who keep the system alive. They are perpetrators. Mr. Lauterbach is a violent criminal. What he is doing is a violent attack on people. He has done measurable damage, and that is wrong. But I also don't believe that he is a pathologically ill person. I can't judge that at all. I haven't examined him, and as an emergency doctor I'm not in a position to diagnose someone psychiatrically. But I find something like that very stupid. Well, I only do it in certain contexts. When there are acute situations, I find that attribution pejorative and not helpful. Because that in him, the evil in him, if you want to call it that, that is also in me, if I am honest with myself. Everyone is capable of acting wrongly, and I wouldn't trust myself either if I had absolute power. I don't want to live in a world with me as the absolute ruler. That's certainly not nice for others. Don't you know me well enough to clap here? A very special person over there. What I meant by that earlier is,
I'll tell you later who he was.
what I always mean is that we have to take action against these perpetrators. But peaceful. We don't have to take revenge on them. We don't have to fight these people, but we have to negate the roles they play. Saying no, you can't do that anymore, you're the wrong person for the post of health minister. Or Marcus. We can use formal terms. You can't take responsibility for the people in this country if you talk about Corona ARF. Or Tobias Hans, who says that the unvaccinated do not belong to society, then you must not make policy in this society. From my point of view, we are not only allowed to do that, we have to. Because to such a perpetrator you have to say, stop it. And that is not only allowed, but necessary. And then we have to say, stop. Here is the limit of what we need to do as a society. Then the view of the individual begins. We must not go so far as to say, he is evil or he is sick. Because, firstly, we cannot judge this from a distance, and secondly, it is our personal point of view. For everything else, ideally we have a functioning judiciary in a civilization. I'm afraid from personal experience we don't have them at the moment, but we need to fix them, because we need it.
I would like to come back to your experience in a moment, but when I hear you, when I listen to you, then I still wonder when you say, he has to go. And then a new one comes along. If we don't change, if we don't help with that, if we still believe that if we mark ballots every 4 years, then it's going to be okay. And here is a new aspect that I would like to bring in, even though it may have little to do with the issue of censorship, but still. If we always have this envy discussion here and say, the Chancellor doesn't get 250,000, but 300,000 euros. And I would say, my God, 300,000 euros is ridiculous for a department head at Deutsche Bank. I don't know what they earn, but don't we simply need better people there, too, who simply go into politics and no longer have to take bribes? Or are no longer bribable, without now generalizing that everyone is? Don't we need a complete rethink there, too?
It's no use getting rid of symbols, so that we understand each other. If we remove the symbol and say that evil will be fought, that's what I meant, but the question went to her.
I want to analyze the discourse of domination, the power structures. And that is also independent of the person. However, a person is elected, at least in Switzerland. But I want to question the system, the discourse of power. What alternative do we have? That's what I want. And then I take that to the individual level. I still extrapolate a lot from the individual level to the societal level. That's what I like to do, and that's where I already have a vision of it. That it is possible for me to recognize the other is not me. Exactly that. And I find that very important. And then this narcissistic puffing up can no longer exist, because one relativizes oneself in this distance to you.
Mr. Hofbauer.
So I think we are living in a time where, interestingly enough, there is such a change. We already talked about a general reorganization and so on. But also a shift, or perhaps a clash between the primacy of economics and the primacy of politics. We all grew up in a society, whether it was Switzerland, Austria, or Germany, not the GDR, where there was a primacy of economics. The big companies determined politics, so to speak. And at some point in recent years, the tide began to turn. I remember a situation in the spring of 2014, when the head of Siemens appeared on the Tagesschau, or to be more precise, was paraded. Namely, he was in St. Petersburg, Russia, at an economic forum when the European Union and the United States had previously imposed the first sanctions against Russia. At that time, it was about the Maidan in Kiev and Crimea. And the moderator asked him, "Why were you there in Russia? We have the sanctions." And he replied, "Well, we have business relations, what does it have to do with that?" In the course of the conversation, however, he slowly became aware that politics now has primacy. A few days later, the head of Mercedes Mr. Zech said in the media, "From now on, the primacy of politics rules. And therefore essential changes in our, capitalist, society, which was not the case until now." And the corona period has actually also shown that on the one hand there was of course pressure from the large corporations to sell these test kits and the vaccine doses, so they are still lying around. In Germany and Austria we have millions of vaccine doses that we will never need. Or if so, then only for something bad. And that's where politics came to the fore and then, for example, decided on these censorship measures. That Germany, the European Union and the major media groups Facebook, Google, YouTube and company more or less forced the deletion via the Network Enforcement Act, and there is something similar in the EU. In the beginning, Facebook and the others said, "No, we don't do that, it restricts freedom of expression." And then they remembered, "Oh, we already know that from Turkey, from China, we have to do it there too. Why shouldn't we do that with the EU?" In this respect, there is already a change that, in my opinion, is somewhat underestimated. We no longer have a capitalist system in the old sense, where the economy actually dictates what is done politically. But politics is beginning to rule it. And in the end it is politics that pumps a lot of money into it. Because who pays for all that stuff, these test kits and the vaccine doses, tens of billions of euros have flowed, that is, our tax money. Without economic rationality, of course, except for the corporations themselves, who benefited from it. But without rationality that helps people. They classify it under health, but it's the opposite. The healthcare system was thinned out, hospitals were closed, beds were cut. All no secret. And I think there's a shift, I see you disagree, from economic to political primacy. I find that pretty exciting.
In the past, it was the clergy.
Excuse me, Mrs. Fischer.
Those in power are variable, that's why I say, we have to dissolve the structures. It used to be the clergy. But I'm calm now, you were before me.
But you are right. You really sum up the whole thing wonderfully.
I would like to ask a question that I would like to bring to the debate now. It is indeed going in that direction. If we have learned something from the corona period and it has now been confirmed again by the events in Ukraine, we have to start again at all levels. And I think when we see what has happened to the media, when we see that we vote for parties that do the opposite 3 weeks after their election, when we realize that even the rule of law is no longer what it used to be, we see that we need a fresh start at all levels. And I believe that our party system is over. But the problem, I'm a big fan of the direct candidates and especially the aleatoric system where you draw lots. As in antiquity, and also later in the Florentine model, you have a cross-section of society. You take so and so many men, women, years, students, craftsmen, and they are only 4 years in office and are advised. If you see what the politicians, the supposedly professional politicians, now have in terms of consulting costs, they can't be much higher if you have citizens. And then solve the whole thing democratically. People who are not corruptible because they are out after 4 years anyway. In the time like to pay princely. And there are many examples.
And also the best in their field.
The best in their field, and if not, then at least they can listen well and know that they are advised by various consultants on so that the opinion really emerges. Let's take Corona example. For 2.5 years we have been waiting to have such a table. On one side sits Wheeler, then Spahn, Lauterbach, and then perhaps someone else from the parliamentary group. And on the other side sits Mr. Wodarg, and then perhaps Mr. Brandenburg, or Bhakti. There are 2 hours of discussion on prime time, and then everyone is supposed to form their own opinion, please. But that doesn't work. None of that is happening, although more and more information is slowly coming out for you to see. Oh, the people who have been very critical, the so-called critics of the measures, maybe they were right somewhere after all. So this is just one of many examples. Now comes the biggest problem. We live in Germany in a very strong economy, we have a country that dominates Europe. And on the other hand, citizens, most of whom, I believe, can't deal with the idea of insecurity, included me. Because I'm not saying one side handles it better than the other. And that the critics of the measures are better able to put up with it. It's not genetically so rooted in me that I can say, I can now very well imagine the situation of anarchy for 10 years. Although for me it is very sympathetic not as a ruleless, but as a model without domination. But I believe that Germany here in the middle of Europe is not predestined to try out this model. Even if it were so urgently needed. And as a transition, it would even be imperative to move forward. Recently, there have been personnel changes, and now there are others in the government. What happens? Now Red-Green governs, and the Greens had on their posters, no weapons in crisis areas. 3 months later, they're screaming guns, guns. You can tell you can't rely on anything anymore. And one last sentence, our immune system that has always accompanied democracy, the free press, is also at its end. I'll give you a brief example because it blew my mind how far it goes. We know many examples, here is the latest one. It's going to be, wait, I have to look, there I have it. The Ministry of Family Affairs is providing 6-figure funding to the Center for Liberal Modernism for the Opponent Analysis project. To finance that. Alternative media are examined to see if they are okay or not. But mostly the thought-provoking sites are attacked. Of all the alternative media, these thought-provoking sites are not the ones that just write random stuff. They are really good journalists, they don't just have commentaries and essays and so on. And then comes a report, I have to quote it briefly. As this study shows, the thought-provoking pages are a strongly ideologized and differentiated argumentative media, which postulates radical resistance and functions as a hinge of conspiracy theoretical thinking. Co-financed by the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs. I'm just saying we have to.
This is something special. Of course, this went through the press a few days ago, so the alternative press, otherwise I would not have read it. But it also means that Ralph Fuchs and Mary-Louise Beck, the 2 people behind this Green Liberal Modern Foundation, are now targeting the thought-provoking pages and using such phrases. That means they no longer direct their attention to the conspiracy theory pages, they probably won't look at them anymore. Now look at these reflection pages. And then others will probably be targeted who criticize on a different level. And that's why I'm so surprised that, for example, with the ban on RT Deutsch, to which I attribute a propaganda function, so I don't belong to them. This is the same propaganda different from how we know it. Interesting to look at both, I would recommend, but do not look only at one side. But that when RT German was switched off, in Germany it was 3 weeks before the Russians invaded the Donbass, that the journalistic representation of the German Journalists Association, Frank Uberl, did not cry out, but cheered. And then it is Albrecht Müller from the reflection pages, and the next one someone else, etc. In history, it happens again and again that the people, who often desperately hope for solidarity and suffer from censorship measures or bans, do not get this solidarity, and years later they themselves are next.
Julian Assange is actually the best example.
Yes, that at all.
Isn't he still being abused for these things? As a warning, don't exaggerate or you'll be in American prison for 175 years. This is a tragedy.
Nobody dares to take him in. He should get the first political asylum in the EU. Clearly.
I agree with that, but what's bothering me, I beg your pardon, but it misses the constructive a bit. I see it similarly, but what do we want to do now? I understand, but what are we doing differently to make it stop? And that's the core for me. We can certainly sit for days and read examples of outrages. I also have a large folder at home with official documents and accusations.
And what was not constructive here?
Constructive would be, how do we change these power structures?
Good question.
How do we create better ones? Interesting what existed in antiquity, but before we create concrete methods now, we are not the new advice here. I find it interesting to think about what are the reasons for these power structures and what makes them interesting. I don't think the balance of power between business and politics has shifted. I've worked for various business lobbies and I can say, pharmaceuticals, cigarette industry, the difference from back then is, today it's open. Today the interdependence is open. Today politics switches to business and vice versa. And as always, the economy is the primacy. Today it is as it used to be. It only looks like a political decision maker is sitting over it, but afterwards he moves to the supervisory board for which he worked. I agree that we have the wrong people in these roles, but that's not because the bad people won, it's because we chose them. That's what you just said, Ms. Fischer. We chose her. And even if I no longer trust the elections in Berlin, at least since the clan criminal Mrs. Giffey and her gang of fraudsters settled there through election fraud, albeit through violations, but people have voted. They officiate because we have a system that favors such people in these structures. So what can we change about the system so that we can attract other people? We need to create incentives so that one of the best in their field or with their character are attracted to go into politics. That is the key question.
But this is also in line with the market. That the best do not go into business, but are responsible for it.
Sure, part of it. Sure, part of it. How do we ensure that a young person who has not learned to take care of themselves does not plan to drop out, join a political party or an interest group? And if he always stands by what they say, they support him. I have nothing against dropouts at all. Some are the most creative and amazing people in the world. But I firmly believe that a person must first learn how to make a living before they can teach other people how to do it. And then I look at that. I really see it as a humiliation of those affected when Arbeitsminister Hubertus Heil explains to me as an entrepreneur which obligations I have to comply with to the Home Office. That's probably a bad joke. And very clear regulations could help here. For example, stipulate that people who go into politics and get elected must first have a certain number of years of professional experience. We should insist on life experience, which the man in office needs. We must limit power. We learned that very early. We have to limit it and share it. What have we seen in the Corona era? A fusion of the executive branch, administration and government, and the legislative branch. Parliament did not act at all. It gave power to the Conference of Prime Ministers, which is not even provided for in the basic law. We have to separate this power again. We must ensure that there is a strong supreme judge in Germany and perhaps in other countries as well. A judge who is truly independent of the executive branch. It is unacceptable that Mrs. Merkel's best friend has dinner with her and is supposed to judge her the next day. This is a merging of power centers that is unparalleled in Germany's post-war history.
But now we are back at.
I just wanted to say one sentence about it. You also say a lot of things that don't work. Do you really think that this system can be saved in any way?
No, absolutely not.
That is what I mean. And that's why my question to you, Ms. Fischer, if I may pass it on, is, how can we make a fresh start from your point of view?
Before we get to the new beginning, I would like to anticipate one more question. If I understand you correctly, this censorship is curtailing freedom of expression step by step. From your point of view, why doesn't it reach the masses? Are these repressive mechanisms? How can you not see that? Are you afraid of leaving your comfort zone? Do you have any idea why? There are enough facts on the table, and dinner is just one of them. Normally there should be an outcry in society at all this.
I would actually like to answer this question by not answering it.
Okay, this is good.
Because that again creates the division that we know better.
No, not at all. It's about understanding. It's about understanding whether you, as a psychoanalyst, have any idea why that is. I don't mean to say that we are the smarter ones, I didn't mean that at all, but just to get an understanding of what it is. Because I think it's the same for all of us, that we often think, why don't you understand this? What is going on there? I've heard that so often. Both sides do not understand. Those who wear masks and feel safe with them do not understand us, just as we do not understand them. Why is that? Your view?
Because both sides split. Division on both sides. And both think they know better. And I think that has to be changed, but also from our side. I've been very critical of measures from the start, but we have to reflect on that.
That means it's an ego battle.
That is, yes, yes. Among narcissists, so to speak, and I don't mean that pejoratively at all. What I mean is, there are these narcissistic puff-ups, and we here are also narcissistic, otherwise we wouldn't be sitting here in front of this audience, we like it. Now to the power structures. The only way to make these puffed-up power structures smaller is to practice acknowledging differences. I keep coming back to the same topic. We should recognize the difference from other people. I've written a big book about hate and ICS, myself too, uniting in aggression to have a common whipping boy, or several, or the system. And that connects us, and we can rant with each other, and so on. So I also like to scold myself. But then we are systemically inherent and we actually do the same thing. We also take the aggression that is projected onto us, we are the evil conspiracy theorists, we also take over these aggressions. And maybe we mix it with our anger, or with our own aggressiveness. That's actually how we do the same thing. What I want us to do is to turn that around. If I may bring an example, for this constructive and destructive aggressiveness, when an infant is at the mother's breast, and the mother says, "Oh, you are destroying my breast," while sucking. That creates guilt in the infant so early, he thinks, not consciously, but unconsciously, aha, my sucking, which normally nourishes me, is damaging my mother's breast. And I don't want to harm her. But that settles in this child. And so will this constructive aggression. Because the child has to suck to eat, that's constructive. But that's reflected as destructive. And we do something like that all the time. Also we at this table, also the audience, we do that all the time. I think if we resolve that in ourselves and in our relationships, then we don't have to look to see if better people come into government, because maybe that government doesn't exist, as well as maybe that discourse of domination doesn't exist.
nicht, diesen Herrschaftsdiskurs vielleicht gar nicht mehr.
I advocate opening up this space, going out into the unknown for once without knowing when to bring it into this system. I don't want this system anymore.
Wen bringen wir denn da in dieses System rein? Ich möchte dieses System gar nicht mehr.
I understand that. Yes, I understand you. We agree on this point. We no longer want the system. Although the other side, I say this deliberately so provocatively, it is precisely this system that wants to preserve itself. And that's where the conflict arises. But if I understand you correctly, that you subordinate interests to personal development, this would have to mean that if personal development were different, there would be no interests.
Also das ist, wenn die persönliche Entwicklung anders liefe, dann würde es keine Interessen geben.
Then it wouldn't?
No interests.
Yes.
My view of the world is quite different. Yes. It is like this.
Yes, you also have another profession. You are entitled to it.
That is why we all sit at this table with different opinions.
But I just have these interests. And there I ask myself, what to do? You say it arises in childhood, but every person can probably still manage it well, to position themselves completely differently to the you, that is, to the other. But I think we live in this society now, as it is now. And the question, what to do, we can discuss of course on the one hand very big, like, change system, however how. Also you said, change system. Or you can start small. I'm rather a bit modest in that respect. Especially because we have the issue of censorship. So abolish censorship is something very important. Gathering ourselves with people, which was not possible for 2 years. So that we sit in the hall with really many people and discuss.
So zusammenkommen mit Leuten, ja, war ja 2 Jahre nicht möglich. Ja. Also, dass man wirklich mit vielen Leuten im Saal und auch wir diskutieren.
Bad, or worst of all, we don't have those at the table to explain to us why they took these measures or why they are now promoting the supply of arms. Yes, that would be good. But we are not so strong. It is our weakness that we cannot convince them that it is important to discuss something like this with us. That would be good.
But that used to be different, right? Earlier I told you about my father, who had very intensive discussions with his friend from a completely different political corner, or what happened in the Bundestag, between Wiener and other people. Wasn't that different in the past?
It was different. It monopolizes itself.
It used to be better.
No, that's not what I mean. It's not about better. I meant, when we realize that we have lost our way with this rigid system that we all want to change. I have also heard it from you. You said, do not put other people in the same functions, but question the system as such. I agree with them 100%. That's what I meant. How do we start? How can we reach our goal? Because there will be a transition period that brings a lot of uncertainty. I think that's exciting, but also scary. What would you recommend about how to really start small, in a small area, but then expand to a large scale?
Specific, please.
Concrete.
But that's what I say all the time.
No, I'm sorry, no. No, sorry, that really is not concrete.
With the recognition of the difference.
This is not tangible. I agree with what I think I understand. But in the fall, electricity bills are likely to be 10 times higher than before. And it doesn't help to think of Karl Lauterbach's mother's breast and say, poor man. No, you're right, and I'm not making fun of it. Rather, I want to show how big the difference is between the immediate reality and the long-term fundamental solution. It is certainly true that there is potential for aggression in such things, but we must act purposefully in order to change our lives. You can of course count on the next generations, and until then we will be patient and practice psychoanalytic therapy. But that doesn't provide a concrete answer to the problem we have. That's why I'm convinced that we need very concrete ideas. What do we do with the system that has now collapsed, that has abandoned the rule of law, that has abandoned the separation of powers and has caused an economic disaster for the people here and will bring an even greater disaster? How can we take concrete political action against this? I see that as important, and what you say is also important, but we need concrete things.
Medio means, oh excuse me. Medio means building such structures.
The question for her.
Do you want to answer directly? Then Mr. Hofbauer.
So, I just don't have these fantasies of grandeur. How can I change everything and the whole? I can become concrete, where it is about me. And that's what I mean by recognizing the difference. We can all do that, now, anytime, starting now. And when that happens, there's a distance. And that then frees me up to change the other person.
Dann gibt es eine Distanz und dann macht mich das frei, den anderen zu verändern.
If I wanted to change the system in this way, I would always end up in a powerless position anyway. I don't want to take on the Goliath. But if I can practice this on a small scale, it will open up a dimension that is subversive, in a positive sense. It opens up subversive fantasies and subversive creativity, always meant in a positive sense. We can't even imagine this now, but I know that this will happen.
Eröffnet, die wir uns jetzt gar nicht vorstellen können. Aber das weiß ich, dass das passieren wird.
I would like a quick question.
May I briefly?
Yes, please.
I even agree with you, dear colleague, but sorry, that's too high for the average consumer. I am sorry. Because that requires. It requires a degree of abstraction to apply this to one's own life. It requires a willingness to look in the mirror.
To be aware.
That's just a platitude. To recognize yourself in your ugliness, in your mistakes, that's incredibly hard. And to admit the mistakes. We're experiencing it live right now.
No, that will open exactly the other dimension. We are in a spiral.
If it succeeds, but your claim is incredibly high that you have.
I don't think so at all.
I would like to.
I find him high.
That's just our difference.
I think what you're saying is right, but I'm afraid it helps, because I don't mean it badly at all about the perhaps somewhat simply structured, emotionally simply structured intellectual.
I'm not so sure.
Excuse me?
I would not be so sure.
I think so. I experience it in my patient discussions. I made a conscious decision to switch to somatic medicine. The surgeons think that you can heal everything with cold steel, and at some point you realize as a surgeon that a lot of things that we cut out are actually somewhere else. It would have been better if nothing had been removed. The problem lay elsewhere. And I often experience in the patients that there is little willingness to think about it because it is a lengthy and laborious process.
Exactly. That takes a lot of energy and strength. Then stop and see the difference.
I don't think I personally have that much objection to it. But tell that to those affected who are fighting back. It's incredibly tedious, and it's not really a bestseller, but rather a slow seller. That was carefully worded. And I'm afraid it really needs very concrete political measures. And it's not a megalomaniac claim that I personally think I could rule in there. But I think we need a concrete proposal, as a vision, as something doable that we can show what can be achieved, because we also need to give people hope. To show something concrete, how it can be improved, and that's important from my point of view.
But of course I consider both to be Herculean tasks. And I also think that then again someone would tell someone else how to do it, like in the example you just gave. And I think that's exactly the problem. What we are doing now in this new party in Germany, in the Basis Party, of which I was a member for a year, that was great. Because somehow you got to know an unbelievable number of people who somehow came from very different opinion groups, many red-green, many disappointed red-green, I would say. And within a very short time I noticed, wow, the structures are very quickly back to the way they were in the established parties. And that's why I still think that as long as this party system exists, it's a good alternative, because at least new things are being tried out there. But to make that concrete, democracy of the Basis Party, where people really vote, where the majority of the population also participates. This is practiced much better in Switzerland, that we don't just vote every 4 years, but have referendums. I heard from a microbiologist in Zurich that people actually vote 3 or 4 times a year on certain decisions. That's much closer to a democratic idea as I imagine it. But even in the Basis Party, I noticed that there was an incredible spirit of optimism. There were great people, alternative health programs or educational programs were immediately considered. Or how can we keep the culture going during this time? And yet we were trapped in a structure that became tight again relatively quickly. Then I saw, okay, the task is obviously much bigger. It's not enough just to found new parties. Take the Pirate Party, for example. They did a great job in Berlin, and in North Rhine-Westphalia 4 months before the election, the Pirates were 9%, the FDP 3%. In the election, the result was reversed. Why? The press did not report fairly on both parties, the Pirates were forgotten. Here, too, we have seen that the whole thing is very closely intertwined, that new parties hardly stand a chance.
They did not change their way of acting, made the same old mistakes, acted logically in the same old system. One could say like Mrs. Fischer, if they had done it differently, who knows what would have happened.
In the system.
Yes, uncertain. Sorry.
We talk about parties all the time, but I think it's over with them. But I want to approach the matter much more modestly, because ultimately it's about discourse hegemony. I mean our view of things, for example, that there should be no compulsory vaccination, just as an example. Or that there should be no war. To put it very bluntly, we are not in the discourse majority on these two issues, but we are threatened. We are threatened by publication bans, we are threatened by social dislocation. And that will certainly come, even to us. I've been walking through a lot of German cities in the last few weeks, and I actually see well-dressed gentlemen with ties in them. We call it a garbage can. I don't know what you call it.
Garbage can.
Garbage can. Sorry, in Austria they call it something else. They put their hands in there for the deposit cans, etc. In the past it wasn't really that dramatic, and now they're everywhere.
Poverty has increased.
And, of course, it will get much worse. That means what we can actually only do, also on the subject of censorship, that we build up, maintain and strengthen the existing structures. I don't mean party political structures, but media versus public, that we build up, maintain and strengthen these structures. And in this way, we may one day enter into a discourse where we ourselves realize that there is precisely no exclusivity. That we don't have to be vaccinated, that you don't supply weapons and at the same time impoverish the population. That is actually clear, that should be obvious to everyone. That if all countries deliver weapons, except Austria as a neutral country, but we are nevertheless with the thing, and Switzerland delivered also no weapons. I think we supplied helmets. But this costs money.
Switzerland built the weapons that we are now supplying. Sorry.
Do they even know that you delivered it? Yes, but to unravel that, to bring that clarity, which is actually obvious, to the people in the first place, that they know and understand that. Because right now, on a lot of the crucial issues that we're talking about here, there's just propaganda. At the moment, there is actually no open reporting in these media, if you look at the public broadcasters in particular. So that's a little bit worse in Germany than it is here. It's bad everywhere. You can actually only switch to platforms like this and similar ones, and they have to be strengthened. That is my absolute conviction.
But I remain convinced that this theoretical or abstract discourse is not really helpful if we want to reach many people. There's a certain percentage of people who aren't as imaginative, not as capable of abstract thinking. I'm convinced that if we want to inspire, to convince that this is the right way, that we have to succeed in getting people who are perhaps less imaginative and who find it difficult to differentiate themselves to do a concrete picture, a suggestion, how it can be different. I think that this is not a major new construction. I am convinced that the basic law we have now is more than sufficient as a basis for a functioning coexistence and a functioning life. Nothing needs to be changed for it to be lived differently. We see that the parties have executed our state. on the basis of this basic law, because they do not live according to it. It is similar with the great religions, where what they do is different from what is written there.
They ignored the basic law.
Yes. They ignored it and interpreted it as they pleased. From the tiny sentence "the parties participate in the formation of political will," they deduce that Ms. Maludryer chairs the ZDF supervisory board, that the parties decide who becomes the supreme judge. None of that is in there. But they interpret it that way. That's why I agree with Ms. Fischer when she says there's a different intention behind it. It's not in the text like that. They bend and justify the text, and I still think we have to say no. On the basis of this basic law, there can be another reality, we just have to want it. I don't think this is a fantasy of overthrow, but a constructive proposal that we need. For many, it doesn't help when we tell them to distance themselves from it and look at themselves. People have concrete problems and strong emotions associated with them. And in these emotions lurks a very bad potential for acts of violence out of great despair and for further destabilization, and I think we have to make very concrete proposals on how to intercept this.
Ms. Fischer, when you say that we have to start with ourselves, and Mr. Brandenburg says it's more theoretical because many people might not understand it at all. So it's all about making decisions. To make the decision to start with oneself on one's own responsibility and self-determination, and not only look outwards to see where the problems lie, but to start with myself and then proceed in small steps. There is no universal answer to this, but what do you think? What is your advice to people who are in a desperate situation, who hear this and say, "Yes, my God, that all sounds so nice, but what should I do?" So they need to get help first, right? What are the first steps?
I think already the analysis of the discourse of power, so, yes. I think the analysis of power relations, whatever they are. And then you can maybe, Yes, that's what I say. First you have to analyze the situation, the discourse of power, and only then can you distance yourself from this discourse. Distance yourself internally. In order not to hurt oneself even more in the indignation. Because in outrage, we take on a more powerful system than we are. So, if you know, if I can distance myself from it emotionally or perhaps intellectually by being able to name this injustice, then I think I can manage. I'm just convinced of it if I can get out of this discourse, just mentally. Then I still have less to eat, or whatever the need is then, but my creative apparatus gets going again. I can say, for example, maybe I'll ring my neighbor's doorbell and ask him for advice, or I'll somehow approach other people with a question about how I could solve my problem now. Then I can react out of concern, out of my emotional concern, which is then taken seriously. I have had my practice for 30 years, there are so many possible solutions. Because this creativity apparatus is activated again, because you are not stuck in this hate discourse, or in the question of guilt between the perpetrator and the victim. Once you're outside, everyone's horizons open up. Then there are no such distinctions.
But is it also the case with people who, well, quite specifically, if I were to look at 4 or 5 of us here, then I would say no matter what happens, we are not the first ones who now economically and also existentially are affected by it if everything really goes down the drain at the end of the year in terms of energy prices, heating costs, etc. But the people who will be affected first, don't they have other problems? In the sense of really concretely improving or changing their life situation? Because of course this way of self-reflection and also the spiritual way and in general the way you just described, if I understood it correctly, to get rid of the guilt problem, and more, but what about for the people who really need to think about it now? Maybe I need a second, third, fourth job to somehow make ends meet? How can this work?
Do I understand you correctly? What helps to take the first steps?
Yes, for the person himself. What happens through reflection, I have to do alone, that's my job, no matter what economic situation I'm in. But something has to come from somewhere. That which really helps to ensure survival. How does it look?
That we show solidarity and not just materially, because we are privileged, we can finance this niche. That we are in solidarity, not only in the material sense, but also in the sense. Again, my refrain with the recognition of differences. That we open up a new vision. And if we have the opportunity, even if the other person is poor and maybe gets food from me, or something like that, we can then build a completely different relationship. This is not a hierarchical relationship, not a debt relationship, but a relationship at eye level.
Eine hierarchische Beziehung ist, eine Beziehung der Schuld, sondern eine auf der Basis der Augenhöhe. Ja.
I think it's too theoretical, sorry, and I think it misses the point a little bit, because it's...
No.
But it's important for our viewers to be able to see that.
Something practical from me.
Please.
I would like to tell you about a great success that we all know about. And which is actually attributable to us, to many of us. Namely, those who would have wanted to continue measures in extenso, especially compulsory vaccination. They have not prevailed. Not in Germany, not in Austria. We as a movement critical of measures, full of very different people, have actually managed to stop this madness, at least temporarily. And I think we can all be proud of ourselves. We must not forget what we have done. If we hadn't been on the streets, at party attempts, in the media, wherever. Our actions to uncover what Bill Gates planned to do with 7 billion shots, I could go on, lockdowns, wearing masks over and over again, etc. If we hadn't been so strong in so many different areas, we would be in a different situation today.
I want to take another run at what my problem is with the lack of concreteness, and I'm afraid I'm stuck with it. I agree with almost everything I understood. Only I remain that it does not help to speak so abstractly and generally. Wherever I walk and stand, I keep calling out, throw away the masks and the evidence. Because I consider that to be the first important step, not to provoke the government, not to make a statement or confront anyone, but I consider it the first necessary step of self-empowerment, for the one who decides that for himself. I no longer make myself the subject of this decree. I don't go to anyone and tear off their mask, anyone who wants to can wear it. But I can clarify myself, free myself from it and say, I reject it and bear all the consequences. I may not be able to shop in my favorite store anymore, I can live with that, I won't starve. Some events I may not be able to attend with my child, I will find another. I think it is necessary to distance myself personally from it. Because putting on a mask and participating somehow, but at the same time keeping an honest distance, that's hardly possible. Not if you get on your knees and do everything. I think it needs concrete things like this. I'm not suggesting that my call to throw away masks is the only right one, you might even have better advice. For me personally, however, it was liberating to say, I won't go along with it. And if I'm thrown out somewhere, then that's it, my life goes on. But I think as many concrete recommendations as possible are needed, and I don't think mine are the best. But I don't have any better ones right now.
Here's how it works in psychoanalysis, but that's how it is in psychoanalysis. We don't give advice, because we don't know any better. Together with the analysand, with the patient, we work out a piece of his history. We do it together. And as an analyst, I'm actually always in the background. But I can work that out together with the patient. What I have found in 30 years of practice is that if you work this out together, a form of relationship emerges that is then a new, experienced, reliable form of relationship. And at the same time, a space opens up for this patient. In this way, he can rearrange his personal psychic household. But I have no influence on that. And I don't want to influence that at all. So we never give advice. Never. And that has really worked. And the creative potential of each individual. If it gets space, you can rely on the effect, because the human psyche is a miracle in terms of self-organization.
I would like to end this round, and I could go on listening for hours. And how are you all? I think. It's so good to listen, because it's also in the differences that the new emerges. And that is what counts in the end, I believe. That each individual feels for himself what is right for him, learns to deal with it and in a certain way also to master his everyday life. Each of us knows that at the moment. I think you said you are afraid, I am afraid, I don't know about you, Mr. Brandenburg, Mrs. Fischer, Mr. Hofbauer, are you still afraid? Or are you now completely free of fear? I too have those moments when I lie there at night and think, oh my God, where is this all going? But I found ways to deal with it, to turn fear into confidence. And I have to say that I learned a lot of new things in this round tonight, for which I am very grateful. For example, this recognition of differences, I think that's an extremely strong image, even if you say, Mr. Brandenburg, that's theoretical, but it's something I'll remember from time to time when it comes to judging someone else for their behavior when it doesn't fit my understanding at all. But that is exactly what the other person's understanding is. In conclusion, I would be interested to know.
Das Verständnis dieser Person ist. Und was mich jetzt nochmal zum Schluss interessieren würde,
what is the perfect resistance, so to speak? Whereby the word resistance is probably not good. So put positively, what can we do? Let's leave out the word resistance, what can we do? There is a nice Swedish saying, a ghost that you try to chase away always grows bigger. What can we do to put the energy into the positive, to really create something new? Mr. Brandenburg.
Let go, don't participate, and focus on the constructive.
Mr. Fischer Rodrian.
Really listen to your feelings, switch on your mind, and don't do something because everyone else is doing it, but look at the matter from many sides. Make a decision for yourself and stand by it. Even if that means playing in front of 60 people, where only 4 are allowed to come together, I do it anyway.
Mr. Hofbauer.
Resistance is a good word, I'll stick with it. And it means for me in the context of what has been discussed today, that we fight for freedom and justice, because without one, the other is worth nothing.
Mrs. Fischer, you are crowning the final word.
Ooh. It just occurred to me now, when I was 20, I had a wish. I went to karate because I really wanted to learn how to fight. And then my teacher.
Okay, now I get scared. Yes.
And in the first lesson, that was such a huge disappointment for me, when the karate teacher said, if someone, with hostile intent, comes towards you, then run away. And if, for some reason, the escape is not possible, then do not oppose the friendly force. Even if you win, you will come out hurt. Well, if you can't run away, and you can't resist, and then comes karate. He said so. And when it's karate's turn, take the enemy's energy and lead it into the void. Past me, into the void. I find that very beautiful.
I would like to thank you very much for this great round. Many thanks to Jeannette Fischer. Many thanks to Hannes Hofbauer. Many thanks to Paul Brandenburg. And a big thank you to Jens Fischer Rodrian. Many thanks to the audience in Düsseldorf. It was a great pleasure to be here live with you for the first time. Awesome, really, really great. And I would like to thank our community for their support, which we urgently need for this project. As Mr. Hofbauer said so well, to strengthen and to lead into the future. Many thanks at this point to everyone here. We now have the Q&A from our viewers to our guests. I am very excited about it and say, until next time. Thank you and good night. See you soon at this point.
Auf Augenhöhe.